Welcome to the entire first semester review of AP US History. This video covers America from European contact all the way to the end of Reconstruction. And since this is probably going to be way too long, please help me out by becoming a channel member. This video is a clipped together video of all my 44 APUSH topic review videos up to Unit 5 without the AP style questions at the end of each video. If you'd like to try your hand at some AP style questions associated with each topic of this course, my unit review playlist will be linked in the description. Anyway, let's get into it. Topic 1.2 is all about societies in the Americas before the contact of Europeans on the continent. The starting thing to know is that before Europeans came into contact with America, there were many societies that existed inhabited by various Native American tribes. For this video, you need to know how they lived in the Americas. The crop of maize or corn became a staple food of many of these native societies, especially the ones in the Southwest, as the cultivation of maize taught these societies advanced irrigation techniques and supported economic development. One of the most notable tribes thriving from this was the Hohokam, who built extensive canal systems for irrigation. In the Great Basin and the Western Great Plains, many tribes saw the dryness in the area and lived by always moving around and not making permanent settlements. Examples of tribes in this area were the Ute and the Shoshone tribes. The Northeast was much different. The Atlantic and the Mississippi River allowed for permanent villages to be made with these societies functioning on agricultural obligations and hunter-gatherers. A notable tribe in this area was the Cahokia. And this was actually very similar to the people in the Northeast in present-day California area, as they also supported themselves on hunting and gathering and used the Pacific shoreline as a good place to build settlements, with one of my favorite tribes in this area being the Chinook. So in our last video, we talked on societies in the Americas before Europeans came in contact. Well, Mr. Christopher Columbus arrives onto America in 1492, and that changes the way of history for the Americas forever. Essentially, the various European countries decided that they were going to explore and conquest this new land. The reasons for this are very simple. It's the 3 G's: gold, God, and glory. First, Europeans wanted to gain more wealth, which was at the time measured in gold and silver under a system called mercantilism. Since there was a lot of gold in the Americas, conquering land allowed for mines to open up and more wealth going to European countries. The second reason was that Europeans saw the native civilizations in the New World and felt a kind of religious obligation to spread and convert the natives to Christianity, with a special effort from Jesuit missionaries. Finally, there was glory. Back then, the more land a country controlled, the more powerful it was considered. The Americas offered a new frontier to claim and show off to the rest of the world. And that's pretty much it. 1.4 is all about the Columbian Exchange and how it impacted Europe and the Americas. So first, we need to define the Columbian Exchange. By definition, the Columbian Exchange means the transfer of goods, foods, animals, flora, fauna, diseases, and slaves between the Americas and Europe after European contact in the Americas. Essentially what happened is when European countries came to America, various things got transferred from one continent to the other. The Americas had revolutionary crops like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco that got transferred to Europe. The influx of these foods to Europe caused there to be a population boom, and the transfer of goods allowed for Europe to shift from an economic system of feudalism, where land was owned by nobles and worked by peasants, to capitalism, where trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. Also during this time, maritime technologies underwent massive improvements, such as the caravel and astrolabe, meaning it was easier for people to explore. What also made it easier was the implementation of joint stock companies. This was a company that a bunch of people could pool their money into, so if it did well, they would all earn money. If not, they could only lose their initial investment, so it was very low risk. These joint stock companies were the companies funding these voyages to the Americas. As for Europe's effect on the Americas, yes, there was goods, foods, and animals brought to the Americas like wheat, rice, horses, and pigs. But the biggest thing that came from Europe to the Americas was deadly diseases. Europeans had been living with diseases like smallpox and measles for many centuries and had gained a sort of natural immunity to them. The natives, however, did not have the same immunity, and therefore when these diseases got introduced, it's said that 50 to 90% of the native population died because of them. And that's all for this. 1.5 is all about slavery in the New World by the Spanish. In my last video, I didn't go much into detail on this, but along with goods, foods, and diseases, slaves were also transported during the Columbian Exchange. The reason for this was, well, we first need to go back in time. When the Spanish landed in the New World, they wanted to harvest the goods and crops of the land, and therefore decided to enslave the natives through the encomienda system. This was a system where Spanish conquistadors were granted the right to extract labor from the indigenous people living in a particular area. In return, the conquistadors were to provide the natives in this area with religious Christian guidance and take care of their welfare. However, in practice, these obligations were often neglected and poorly fulfilled. This enslaving of the natives wouldn't end up working though, for two reasons. First, the natives knew the land that they had lived on for centuries better than their European guests, and therefore could escape pretty easily. And second, the natives were dying in mass numbers by smallpox, and you can't enslave a dead person. The way Spain solved this was by transporting slaves from Africa to the New World on ships with the brutal journey known as the Middle Passage and work the land. This solved both problems because the Africans wouldn't know the land, and they have the same natural immunity to smallpox that Europeans did. With these many Africans on the continent, it allowed for a caste system to form known as the casta system, where natives and Africans were on the bottom and anyone with Spanish blood was on the top. We'll be going into more detail on the African slave trade in a future video. For now, that's all.
Topic 1.6 is all about different views in the world during this time, along with some organized military resistances. So it's fair to say that any time in history, when an existing culture interacts with a new culture, misinterpretations and profiling will always happen from both sides. In terms of the natives and Europeans, their cultures had different worldviews on religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. Over time, Europeans and Native Americans adopted some useful aspects of each other's culture. But as Europeans increasingly attempted to enslave the natives, different military defenses from the natives happened. A few examples of this were the Capul Uprising in the Yucatan and the Taino Rebellion in the Caribbean. And even though documents like the Requerimiento tried to justify harsh treatments of the natives, it sparked debates from around the continent of how Africans and Native Americans should be treated. Though these arguments did exist, any arguments often led to Europeans justifying their treatment of Africans and the natives using culture or race as an answer. Unfortunately, that is most of what early U.S. history is about. Topic 2.2 is about not just Spanish efforts in the New World, but the French, Dutch, and British efforts as well. So I should preface this all by saying that the Spanish were not the only ones in the New World, though they were the forerunners. Other European countries came in too after hearing of the riches of the New World. Let's start with a little review on the Spanish. So the Spanish find the New World and try to enslave the natives under the encomienda system. This, however, faced criticism throughout the country, so in some areas they replaced their system to the repartimiento system, which was supposed to be less exploitive and for shorter periods. But it still led to horrid conditions for the natives. In an attempt to justify their colonization, the Spanish forcefully converted a fair amount of the natives to Christianity. And after the slavery of the natives didn't really work, they transported slaves from Africa and enslaved them to work under a system called asiento. Okay, that's the Spanish's way in the New World. Now let's talk about the French and the Dutch. They were a lot nicer to the natives and sent few Europeans to the continent and attempted to make trade alliances along with marry some of the natives in an attempt to build economic and diplomatic relations to export products like furs to Europe. With the French making their Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, and the Dutch continuing to build their fur trade empire through strategic alliances focused on cooperation. And finally, the English. English men and women migrants like John Smith and John Winthrop were attracted to the New World for 4 reasons. First was social mobility, as they believed they could potentially raise their social standing moving to the New World. Next was economic prosperity, as colonists believed the Americas were a gold mine where they could potentially grow wealthy from. Third was religious freedom, as groups like Puritans, Pilgrims, and Quakers were being persecuted in Europe, and especially England, causing them to seek new grounds to worship freely. And finally, improved living conditions, as the colonies offered a new life and new opportunity that could be better than living in Europe. Once the colonists moved to the New World, English settlers often took land from the Native Americans, sometimes through treaties, but more often through force. And the colonies they created centered their economies on agriculture, but more on that next. So we're gonna have some fun with this video, all about British colonies and how they functioned. But before we get to that, I need to tell you about English arrival into the New World. So the British come into the New World and expect to find vast amounts of gold in Virginia and along the Atlantic coast. This ends up not happening, but the Americas still offered the British cash crops like tobacco and rice, so they end up making farms in their various colonies. The people on these farms were mostly indentured servants, who were English workmen and women that in exchange for passage to the New World, they would have to work the land for a set number of years, which would normally average around 7. Now this worked for a while, but after a while there was a shortage of indentured servants, along with the growth of African slavery, which inevitably caused indentured servitude to fail. Now, to talk about the British colonies, I have for you a random woman I paid off a $5 to voice over this part of the video. to notice is how unusually democratic British colonies at this time were. Like the New England colonies ran on town meetings, and the southern colonists were ran by elite planters with elected assemblies, which were basically unheard of at the time. The most notable of all is to talk about the Chesapeake Bay colonies, with a special emphasis on the town of Jamestown in Virginia, which was the first official permanent English settlement in 1607, and was easily the most popular of all English colonies with its tobacco exports and its unique government style. And that is all. Topic 2.4 is all about the transatlantic trade. The main thing to take away from all of this is all Europeans really wanted from the New World was profit. Crops in the New World were so unbelievably profitable by the Europeans that, heck, there's an argument that without the crop of sugar, there is no African slave trade. And as goods and slaves were being transported, a system of trade known as the triangular trade, where European ships carried manufactured goods such as guns, cloth, and alcohol to Africa in exchange for African slaves to be transported to the New World and have them undergo the Middle Passage, which saw Africans chained and tightly cramped together in ships to the New World. And finally, in the Americas, the enslaved Africans were sold and the ships were loaded with raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then transported back to Europe. As you can see, this way of trade resembles a triangle, which is why it's known as the triangular trade. This trade would also cause diseases like smallpox to be spread to the New World and syphilis to be spread to Europe. Meanwhile, in North American colonies, the British government continuously attempted to incorporate their monarchical and hierarchical structure in the colonies for the point of earning the most wealth, which would inevitably receive pushback from the colonists and the American Indians, with one such example being the Bacon's Rebellion, where after the governor of Virginia refused to expel the Native Americans from Virginia, a man named Nathaniel Bacon rebelled and with a group of around 400 followers tried to overturn that decision and kill the natives. Although the British suppressed this rebellion, it highlighted the potential for colonists to revolt, foreshadowing the larger conflicts that would lead to the American Revolution. Topic 2.5 is all about the interactions between Native Americans and Europeans and how it changed from my last video on topic 1.6. The basic thing to know is that even before European contact, Native American tribes always fought each other. Now we start seeing Native American groups ally with European countries in an attempt to once again fight against other tribes. But even though this did happen, we still see Europeans expand and encroach on Native American land, with a prime example being Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War, which was the bloodiest battle in American history relative to the population of the time. This war started because English colonists broke treaties made with the natives and continued to forcefully expand past the natives' land, and with the killings of a few people along with some other reasons, the war began. King Philip was with the Native Americans and fought against the colonists along with a few Native American tribes. In the end, it was said that over 7,000 people died, and the colonists ended up winning. The effect of the end of this war was the sort of end of Native American power in the New England colonies. Though most all Native American resistances failed, there were a few that succeeded. One of which was the Pueblo Revolt, where the indigenous Pueblo peoples successfully revolted against the Spanish. The aftermath of this was that it led to the Spanish accommodation of some aspects of American Indian culture in the Southwest. But this would end not really mattering, as decades later the Spanish would end up taking the land of the Pueblo peoples. We already know that there was a shortage of indentured servants, and therefore the British started participating in the African slave trade. The system that African slaves were employed under the Spanish was called asiento, but in English colonies they were employed under a separate system known as chattel slavery, where slaves were treated as property and not people. These African slaves worked heavily in the Chesapeake Bay and southern Atlantic coast, but the majority of them were in the West Indies. As chattel slavery became dominant, the interracial relationships between colonists and slaves became illegal, which made Africans only breed with other Africans, and new laws were put in place that their children would automatically be slaves. I know, it's awful. But even with this level of hopelessness, some Africans rebelled, with an example being the First Maroon War. But most that didn't rebel tried to survive by maintaining their own people's culture. One example of this being the Gala community, which maintained African traditions such as dancing to West African music during their rare moments of relaxation. That's all. I've talked a lot on slavery and the African slave trade in colonies, and it's because that slavery was a massive aspect of colonies. In topic 2.7, we move away from the connotation of slavery and talk about other societies' cultures. The fact is, in all European colonies, there existed lots of different religions and ethnic groups, causing acceptance of diversity in colonies, and the word for that is pluralism, along with varying degrees of intellectual exchange. European leaders saw their colonies in the Americas as moneymakers and nothing else. The actual truth was that these colonies made their own unique culture and way of democratic governance. European leaders continued to clash with their colonies on things like the Navigation Acts, which lowered trade with their colonies and ended up hurting the colonies. The Enlightenment also started in Europe, which was an intellectual movement of reason and science. This would have a heavy influence on colonists later when the revolution would start with the ideas like freedom of religion and equality. But in this video, all you need to know is the initial response to the Enlightenment in the colonies, which was the First Great Awakening. This occurred in the colonies, where it saw the revival of Christianity in the British 13 colonies. This Christianity was traditionally the British's form, being Anglicanism, but it shifted throughout decades in the First Great Awakening to branches of Protestantism like Baptists and Methodists. We also see a rise in the spread of Protestant evangelicalism. The Transatlantic prig culture also started in the colonies, where you start seeing the communication via press. The fact is that this culture had a different way of life, government, and reason that differed from European thought. Europeans didn't really like this and frequently clashed with their colonies. That, however, is something to talk about next year. Topic 3.2 is on the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So to start this one off, I'm going to ask a question. What was the First World War? You might say, well, World War I, because it has a 1 in it. Some historians, however, would argue the 7 Years' War was the First World War because there was involvement from countries all over the world. The fact is, this war is complex and was fought in many theaters, but for AP US history, we will only examine the US side of things. This war started because of territorial disputes, particularly in the Ohio River Valley, and mostly in the New World between the British and the French. British peoples were moving to the colonies in massive numbers, and this forced the British to expand, threatening French-Indian trade networks and American Indian autonomy. But let's be real, this might be the official cause of the war, but Britain and France had had beef before this war, and this was kind of the chance for them to settle that beef. The French and British had allied with many native tribes, and so colony armies combined with Native Americans would fight in this war. The war started with the Battle of the famous Fort Necessity, which the British lost. Notice the number of troops on both sides of this battle. It's very small. The only thing you should maybe know about this battle is it featured the general of George Washington. In the early half of this war, it's fair to say that the British were heavily losing. The French just kept winning each battle, and the British were just sleepy. I mean, take a look at the Battle of Monongahela. The French had around 400 troops, and the British had 1,300. Despite having 3 times the manpower, Britain still lost this battle because of their conventional line infantry tactics, as opposed to the French and Indians' guerrilla warfare tactics. However, the tide turned after 1758, as Britain leveraged its superior naval power and resources to gain the upper hand. Key victories at Quebec and Montreal in 1759 and 1760 were crucial to their successes, and finally in 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the war ended. By this point in the war, there was so many more forces than the beginning. There are 2 big outcomes of this war that you should know. First, the French lost almost all of their territorial claims in the Americas, and they were split up amongst the British and the Spanish. The second is that this war made both Britain and France heavily broke. For Britain, this resulted in the imposition of new taxes on the American colonies, but I get ahead of myself. In France, the financial crises caused by the war was one of the factors that led to the French Revolution. After the British victory, imperial officials attempted to prevent colonists from moving westward, and this generated colonial opposition, while native groups sought to both continue trading with Europeans and resist the encroachments of colonists on tribal lands. Now we start talking about the causes of the American Revolution, which usually brings up 2 fields of thought: philosophical causes and direct causes. This video will be on the direct causes, being the British taxation. So the basic question to ask here is, with so much diverse peoples in the colonies of the Americas living different lives, how exactly is this random group of people going to come together enough to incite a revolution? The answer is a common enemy, and a few other reasons. The British had become heavily in debt because of the 7 Years' War, and therefore started taxing their colonies in the Americas through acts. 1764, the Sugar Act was passed, where the British taxed imported sugar. 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which required colonists to purchase stamped paper for any document. 1767, the Townshend Acts are passed, which put taxes on imported goods like paper, paint, and tea. These 3 acts finally started getting colonists to think. The fact is, the American colonies were subject to British laws, including taxes, but had no representatives in the British Parliament to voice their interests or concerns. The British argued that they did have a voice by proxy, but the colonists denied it. The Sons of Liberty was a group who boycotted and protested against the British. The Stamp Act Congress convened, where representatives from several colonies met to formally protest the Stamp Act. Also of note was efforts of people like Ben Franklin, who helped rally colonists into one united culture. In 1770, continued British military presence in the colonies caused the Boston Massacre, where English soldiers fired upon revolting colonists and killed 5. In 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act, which put a tax on tea, which everybody was drinking at the time. This caused the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped the tea into the British harbor. This all led Britain to passing the Intolerable Acts in 1774, which closed the British harbor and gave a hit to local governments. By 1775, these issues, along with others like restrictions on westward expansion and stuff we'll go over in next video, had set the stage for the outbreak of the American Revolution. The American Revolution causes leads into 2 fields of thought: philosophical and direct causes. This video is on the philosophical causes. So if you remember back in Unit 2, I said the Enlightenment also started in Europe, which was an intellectual movement of reason and science. This would have a heavy influence on colonists later when the revolution would start. So around the same time all these taxes are being imposed by the British, the Enlightenment is running rampant through Europe. And because of the Atlantic world, these Enlightenment ideals get spread to the British colonies. First we have John Locke, who argued in his book Second Treatise that every person is born with a natural right to life, liberty, and property. And this might sound familiar, as this exact idea is written into our Declaration of Independence. Then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued in his book The Social Contract that when people live under a government, they enter into a so-called social contract, where they give away some of their freedoms for government benefits. And finally, we have Baron de Montesquieu, who argued in his book The Spirit of Laws that there should be a separation of government into 3 branches. And there were plenty of philosophers like Voltaire and Hobbes who argued against European government style and favored a more Republican-style government. This all caused colonists to believe in the superiority of Republican forms of government and natural rights of citizens. This is best illustrated in a book by Thomas Paine named Common Sense, where he directly petitioned colonists to declare independence from Britain, and also arguing that a republican government based on the consent of the people was the best form of government, and that the British monarchy was tyrannical and harmful to the colony's interests. And I want you to think about this for a second. By calling it common sense, Paine made radical ideas like declaring independence and rejecting monarchy seem obvious and reasonable to everyday colonists. All of this Enlightenment thought, including this book by Paine, would be engraved in the ideas of the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. These philosophical causes, combined with British taxation, set the stage for the revolution. So the stage is set. Britain has levied many taxes on the colonies, and the colonists, inspired by Enlightenment thought, are reasonably mad. In response to the Intolerable Acts of 1774, the colonists convened at the First Continental Congress to try and solve the issue. However, then militiamen engaged with British troops in the town of Lexington, and once those British troops marched to the town of Concord, even more militiamen fired upon them, forcing them to retreat under constant guerrilla-style attacks on their march back to Boston. The revolution had begun, and understand that the colonies didn't have an organized army. At the Second Continental Congress, colonists attempted to fix this by establishing the Continental Army. However, this army headed by George Washington was filled with militiamen who had no formal military training. England had been established for thousands of years and had an organized military and financial advantages. Because of this, the first part of this revolution saw the British winning most every battle. Bunker Hill, Quebec, Long Island, Fort Washington. All of these battles saw the British winning, but showed that colonists could put up a fight. This especially is shown in the Battle of Trenton, where Washington's surprise attack after crossing the Delaware River saw the colonists win. It was also around this time that Thomas Paine published Common Sense, and later America would declare their independence. The fact is, throughout all of these early engagements, colonists' morale was boosted and forces kept growing in the colonies, which caused colonists to win more battles. This all culminated in the turning point of the revolution being the Saratoga Campaign. Throughout the entire early part of this revolution, leaders like Ben Franklin had tried to get the French to join the revolution on the colonist side. When the colonies won the Battle of Saratoga, this finally convinced the French to join the revolution. Now we start seeing the colonists along with the now French victories in this revolution. Stony Point, Newton, Kings Mountain, Chesapeake, all leading to one decisive battle in the town of Yorktown, where rough fighting for over 3 weeks with a joint American and French siege that trapped the British caused the colonists to win. And finally, in 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the revolution was over, with the British finally recognizing America's independence. And anyone can argue the true reason America won. However, looking at the troop numbers from the beginning of this revolution to the end, the one thing to take away is that it was the colonists' ideological commitment, resilience, and assistance sent by European allies that truly caused America to come out on top. So the revolution is over. The question is, what effect did it have on society? Well, one of the things often glossed over about the revolution is that there were calls for abolition of slavery, hence garnering the name abolition movements. The reason for this was because of increased awareness of inequalities in society, and of course the Enlightenment, which caused people like Anthony Benezet before and through the revolution to continue writing books calling for the abolition of slavery. It did end up working, but only in little states like Pennsylvania, where they passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery, which gradually got rid of slavery in Pennsylvania. This was the first act of its kind and set a precedent for future abolitionist movements. There were also many other abolition movements in other northern territories like Massachusetts. Women played crucial roles in the revolution, often working as nurses, seamstresses, and managing households in their husband's absence. This increased participation, along with Enlightenment-inspired feminism orchestrated by Enlightenment thinker Mary Wollstonecraft, caused women to call for more expanded roles in society. Abigail Adams, in a letter to John Adams, pleaded for him to remember the ladies, and Judith Murray, in her On the Equality of the Sexes, used theology and reason to explain the equality of men and women. This would lead to a growing idea of Republican motherhood, which called on women to teach Republican values within the family and granted women a new importance in American political culture. However, women wouldn't start getting true rights until the first wave feminism of the mid-19th century. And last thing to note is the American Revolution's effect on the rest of the world. Debt caused by the American Revolution, along with many other reasons, caused France to go through a radical, bloody revolution. Haiti, being inspired by the American Revolution and a lot of other reasons, caused a slave rebellion in which they won. And once again, the influence of the American Revolution was a factor in causing a series of revolutions throughout Latin America. And though each of these revolutions had their own modicum of reasons for breaking out, the fact is, the American Revolution and its influence is a reason for each one. So I'm sure you were wondering how the colonies are governing themselves after this revolution. Well, first, states throughout the Americas around the end of the revolution started implementing their own state constitutions, which typically placed power in a legislative branch and kept that only people who owned property could vote. However, these constitutions showed America was not unified, and rather a bunch of separate states. Something called the Articles of Confederation were implemented at the Second Continental Congress, however states didn't really recognize it. In 1781, by the end of the Revolution, over a ratification process of 4 years, the Articles of Confederation finally came into power. The Articles created a central government for handling common concerns of the states, like diplomacy, defense, and managing Western territories. However, it was internally weak to avoid the kind of centralized authority that the colonies had rebelled against. The federal government created by the Articles could not enforce laws directly on the states or citizens. It had no power to tax and was largely dependent on state cooperation. Despite its weaknesses, the Articles did achieve successes, such as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a framework for westward expansion. It established guidelines for admitting new states, promoted public education, protected private property, and banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. But anyone could see that there was a glaring issue with these articles, and this would lead to our next topic on the Constitutional Convention. Federalism, an idea that combines a general government with regional governments in a single political system. The Articles of Confederation was the original attempt at being a Federalist document. The issue is that it didn't maintain a balance between states and the federal government and gave states too much power, and this ended up making the documents being weak. State representatives all knew this and decided to meet in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, where they would, through negotiation, collaboration, and compromise, draft a new form of government, being the Constitution, which made a more central government. The actual details of the Constitution will be covered next topic. For now, let's talk about this convention. The idea of federalism changed as a result of this convention. The way it changed was articulated in a document known as the Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton and Madison, arguing a strong central government was necessary to create a perfect union and to protect the individual liberties of the people. So basically, it was condemning the articles that did not achieve this central government. Then a new group would pop up opposing this imposition of the new constitution, known as the Anti-Federalists. People in this Anti-Federalist group, like Patrick Henry and George Mason, argued that the Constitution didn't address states and individual rights enough. Because of this, to ensure the Constitution would be ratified, Federalists promised the addition of the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the United States. They emphasized individual rights and explicitly restricted the powers of the federal government to appease the Anti-Federalist groups. The best way to describe the Constitution is Ben Franklin's speech at the convention, where he said he didn't approve of parts of the Constitution, but acknowledged that a perfect document would be impossible, and this was likely the best thing that could be made. However, there was always one big issue, and from now until 1865, slavery
slavery will be that issue. The Constitutional Convention compromised on slavery by doing two things. First, they would pledge that Congress could not prohibit the international slave trade until 1808. Second, they made it so enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person when calculating a state's population for representation in Congress. Hence, it was known as the 3/5 Compromise. But understand that even though slavery was such a glaring issue, know that the word slavery was actually never mentioned in the Constitution. And that's all one today. The Constitutional Convention, though originally happened to change the articles, caused a new document to come out of it explaining a new way of government that is still used to this day. It created a central government that the articles lacked, but also allowed the powers to be limited to embody federalism. There was still an issue though. People from states with a low population wanted an equal share in voting rights in the country, and people in states with higher populations wanted more voting rights because they had more people. This is where we see the great compromise of having the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate based on equal voting rights to each state. This constitution saw the implementation of three branches of government that are all supposed to have equal levels of power with the ability to check the power of each other branch, with the judicial housing the Supreme Court, the executive housing the president, and the legislative branch housing the House and the Senate. And through a lot of different ways explained in AP Government, each branch has its own specific ways of checking powers of the other branches to make sure one branch doesn't get too powerful. And in this way, we see the Constitution embodying the idea of federalism very well. So the Constitution is implemented and Washington becomes America's first president, shortly followed by John Adams. During their presidencies, foundational institutions were created to implement the Constitution, such as the establishment of the Executive Cabinet and the Judiciary Act of 1789, which would establish the federal court system, giving the judicial branch actual power. Specifically, Washington set important precedents, including serving only 2 terms and establishing a tradition of civilian leadership over the military. In the early years of the Republic, political leaders debated key issues like the balance of power between state and federal governments, economic policy such as the creation of a national bank, and the proper approach to foreign policy. These debates led to the formation of the first 2 political parties in the United States, the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, favoring a strong central government and pro-British foreign policy, and the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, advocating for states' rights and pro-French policies. These parties would cause separation that we even still see today. Washington warned against this in his 1796 farewell address, where he warned the nation against political factions, fearing they would divide the country. He also advised against becoming entangled in permanent foreign alliances, promoting a policy of neutrality that shaped U.S. foreign policy for years to come. After the American Revolution, the U.S. government had to navigate the continued presence of British and Spanish forces in North America. Britain specifically was participating in an act known as impressment, where the British Royal Navy forcibly seized men and forced them into naval service. So once the Napoleonic Wars broke out in Europe between Britain and France, the U.S. had to maintain neutrality, which was difficult due to issues like British impressment on American sailors and French demands for U.S. support under the Franco-American alliance, with the Federalists favoring Britain and the Democratic Republicans supporting France. Despite all of this, the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 passed by Washington officially declared neutrality. Over back in America, Spain expanded its influence by establishing mission settlements in California, relying on the labor of local Native American tribes. This would allow a cultural exchange around the California area at the expense of Native Americans. As American settlers moved westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains, they sought access to key resources like the Mississippi River for trade. The U.S. negotiated treaties like Pinckney's Treaty in 1795, which granted Americans free navigation of the Mississippi to secure territorial and commercial interests. America was developing itself in its early years, but expansion westward would cause so much conflicts leading up to a certain war in 1861. But I get ahead of myself. Now we're going to move to talking about society and culture in the early society of the Americas. In the years following the American Revolution, a new national identity began to form. Americans, now free from British rule, wanted to define what made them unique. In literature, we see the work of people like Charles Brockden Brown, whose Wyland became one of the first American Gothic novels, focusing on uniquely American fears and experiences. The same search for identity appears in Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer, where he famously calls Americans a new man, different from Europeans, blending many cultures into something distinctly American. This cultural shift wasn't just about words, it was visual too. Federal architecture is a great example of how Americans blended old European styles with a new democratic aesthetic. Take Garrard's Bank in Philadelphia, completed in 1797. The building represents strength and stability. Religion continued to play a key role, especially in regional identities. Inspired by the First Great Awakening and the revolutionary ideas of liberty, figures like Gowan Pamphlet, the first known Black Baptist preacher, founded the First Baptist Church in Williamsburg, Virginia. His messages of equality showed the ongoing struggle for freedom and opportunity for all Americans. Science and philosophy also left their mark. The 1789 portrait of Franklin by Charles Wilson Peale highlights his status as a philosopher and a scientist.
depicting him with a lightning rod, a symbol for his contributions to understanding electricity. John Trumbull's portrait of Washington and William Lee showed how painters crafted a visual narrative celebrating the American Revolution. These cultural developments reflect the growing sense of national identity in America, even as regional differences remain strong. The country's culture was evolving, from its art and literature to its religion and architecture. I said two things within my past videos. First, I said slavery will be the big issue until 1865. And second, I said westward expansion would cause the Civil War. In this period around 1800, we start seeing the start of this. Migrants continuously moved west, searching for a new life. The issue of this is that these migrants were encroaching on Native American land. This made Native Americans rethink their alliance with the US and start something known as the Northwest Indian War, and rebel, with some examples being St. Clair's defeat in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Even the federal government had attempted to test its federal power in this frontier tension, imposing a violent whiskey tax and prompting a rebellion against it. In the expansion westward, Britain took the side of Native Americans and provided support against the US, which would heighten tensions between the US and Britain, which would eventually cause another war to break out. The other thing to mention is the growing split between the North and the South. We start seeing these two areas separate on values around this time. The main reason for this was slavery. The South had slavery implemented heavily throughout its territories, and once they expanded westward, more slavery was implemented. This caused various anti-slavery sentiments to arise, such as Gabriel's Rebellion, where Virginia slaves rebelled and it ended in a violent suppression. Another example of this was the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery mentioned in previous videos. But overall, even with the split starting to emerge between the North and the South, lots of historians argue that this point in history was when Americans were most unified.
4.2 is about the age of Jefferson's term in office and really what just happened. So, Thomas Jefferson, a die-hard Democratic Republican, takes office after the Federalist rule of Adams. Continuing into this period, we have these two parties debating over relations with the French and the British and powers of the federal government. All things covered in my Topic 3.10 video. But we start seeing debates over something new around this period known as tariffs, which is a tax on imported goods, meaning goods coming into America. This tax is paid by American companies, which typically raise their prices to accommodate for the tax. Understand that in a world where the South is typically known as a rural agrarian expanse known for farming, and the North is known for their industries and manufacturers, the South would be negatively affected by these tariffs as they need to import lots of goods because of the lack of industries they have. The North would benefit from this tax as Americans would start only buying American manufactured goods. The Democratic Republicans hated the idea of tariffs, aligning themselves with the South. The Federalists liked the ideas of tariffs, aligning themselves with the Northern view. During Jefferson's presidency, he enacted the trade embargo of 1807, which made it so America would stop importing Britain's goods. This would end up backfiring and hurting the American economy. But possibly the most famous part of Jefferson's presidency was the case Marbury v. Madison, which was a Supreme Court case that established the concept of judicial review, which allowed the Supreme Court to review and invalidate actions taken by the other branches of government if they are deemed unconstitutional. And another popular thing is even more westward expansion. The US wanted the land of New Orleans and negotiated with France to get it. France offered the entire Louisiana territory as they were facing financial issues because of Napoleon, and the US bought it for $15 million. Now with all this territory, the US wanted to map it, so they sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition with the Native American guide of Sacagawea to help them. They went all the way from St. Louis to the Pacific and mapped out the western territories and realized truly how big it was. Topic 4.3 starts talking about tensions in the US economy and differing viewpoints. Some war broke out between Britain and the US in 1812 caused by British supporting Native American tribes and impressment on American sailors. It ended in a draw with the Treaty of Ghent that the US saw as a win, mostly because of the nationalism caused by the Battle of New Orleans. During this war, Federalists met at the Hartford Convention discussing disapproval of the war and potential secession. After America quote-unquote won this war, this convention would lead to the party's demise. And that leads into the introduction of a man who lots of people don't like, including me, Henry Clay. This guy was a lawyer, Secretary of State, leader of a future political party, and so influential in this period. He introduced something known as the American system. This was a response to the War of 1812 and suggested to provide national economic growth by establishing a protective tariff, creating a national bank, and funding internal improvements like roads and canals. This was so controversial and caused many debates to arise from the Democratic Republicans, later known as the Democrats, who opposed it, and the New National Republicans, later known as the Whigs, who supported it. The Supreme Court had its say with its McCulloch v. Maryland case, which established that federal power trumps state power. But who cares about that? It's time to talk about early Civil War causes. So throughout the early republic, states kept getting added and became either a slave or free state. As this continued, in 1819, there was a balance of 11 slave states and 11 free states. But as America was expanding westward, Missouri was added as a state. The South wanted it to be a slave state, and it ended up becoming one. The North, however, felt cheated and made the Missouri Compromise, which added Maine as an official free state and said above a certain line there couldn't be any more slave states. This shows the start of weak compromises, creating tension upon tension until eventual war. And how about even more Civil War causes? The Protective Tariff of 1828 put a tax on imported goods, and the South was very mad at it, even to the point they called it the Tariff of Abominations. This led to the South Carolina Exposition and the Nullification Crisis, where the South openly protested the tariff. There likely would have been war if it wasn't for Calhoun and Clay, who proposed the Tariff of 1833, which would lower the tax over the years. But what this shows is the South can and will revolt if it doesn't like something, foreshadowing the eventual Civil War. Topic 4.4 is about America's relations with other countries throughout the beginning of the 19th century. So it's fair to say America was struggling in this time to create a global presence. Turns out, inciting a revolution to create a nation doesn't get respect from other nations that have been on the globe for much longer. The US tried to rectify this through things like the War of 1812, but they needed more land. What they did first was acquire Florida from Spain in 1819 under these two treaties, and they also started a war where they forced the Seminole tribes out of the Florida lands. The US also decided to prove their naval might, which they did by inciting the Barbary Wars against North African states. But the big thing to talk about is, as America kept spreading westward, there was more and more conflict with Native Americans. Britain saw this as an opportunity to support the Native Americans against the Americans. This would cause President James Monroe to pass the Monroe Doctrine, which declared to Britain that any involvement in America by European powers would be seen as an act of war. And to add insult to injury, America also passed Macon's Bill No. 2, which prohibited French and British warships from entering American harbors. Topic 4.5 introduces the Market Revolution. The time of which great innovation in mechanization, agriculture, and commerce occurred is largely called and known as the Market Revolution, which is just a little part of the larger industrial evolution of the world. Inventions like the textile machinery, steam engines, interchangeable parts, the telegraph, and agricultural inventions made production methods of different products so much faster and easier, causing entrepreneurs to make a lot of goods and businesses, causing people to buy more goods, and you get the idea. One thing to note about the Market Revolution is the difference in evolution between the North and the South. The North became a place for all industries, housing all types of manufacturing and businesses. The advent of the cotton gin caused the South to farm cotton furiously, making the South grow up making mostly farms, having slaves work at them, and selling the cotton from those farms for massive amounts of money. Now, of course, the South needed to sell these goods to other countries mostly, but different legislation and judicial systems, support of development of roads and canals and railroads caused American regional markets and selling to grow. This would link the North and the South heavily, but it should still be noted that no matter how much the North and South are connected in this time period before the Civil War, these areas were different on values and culture and could not coexist peacefully with one another. The Market Revolution would also have a massive impact on society and culture as well, but that is a next video problem. Topic 4.6 introduces the societal and cultural impacts of the Market Revolution. The innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce we talked about last time didn't just make goods and businesses. They changed how people lived, worked, and thought about themselves. Large numbers of international migrants flooded into industrializing northern cities to find factory work. An example of a city growing heavily industrialized from this being Philadelphia. At the same time, a lot of Americans moved west of the Appalachians, building new communities along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, with some cities growing here like St. Louis and Cincinnati. This movement created a new dynamic between regions as the North urbanized while the West focused on agriculture. Next, let's talk about wealth and class. Manufacturing growth led to higher standards of living for some folks, creating a bigger middle class and a wealthy business elite. But it should be noted, it also created a large and growing population of laboring poor who worked for long hours for low wages in these factories. Life was better for some, but definitely not for all. As for gender and family roles, with the rise of factories, many Americans, both men and women, stopped relying on farming to survive. Instead, they worked to produce goods for distant markets. This shift brought about new ideas of gender roles. Women especially were expected to stay home and embrace domestic ideals, which emphasized the separation of public work life for men and private home life for women. Not everybody was happy about this. Topic 4.7 talks about expanding democracy from 1800 to 1848. Democracy in America went from being exclusive to rich, landowning white men to slightly less exclusive. By the 1840s, almost all adult white men could vote. So is that progress? Kind of. The big shift came with the elimination of property requirements for voting. Before this, you had to own land to cast a ballot, but as more states dropped this rule, voting rights expanded, and participatory democracy became a thing. One key event you should know is the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island, where Thomas Dorr and his supporters pushed for a new state constitution to expand voting rights, since the original charter only let landowners vote. Basically, more people got involved in politics. However, it's important to note this only applied to white men. Women, Black Americans, and indigenous people were still left out. Now, with more people voting, political parties formed. The actual details of these political parties will be covered next video. But for now, all you should know is that the whole political framework of the 1820s up to the Civil War was known as the second party system. Oh boy, Andrew Jackson. We already get to talk about such an amazing man. And before I get canceled on Twitter, I'd like to say that I'm using a rare attribute called sarcasm. So new political parties emerged in the 1820s and 1830s. On one side, you had the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson, who believed in a limited federal government. Jackson was all about the common man, opposing elites and big government institutions. He famously hated the National Bank, calling it a corrupt tool of the wealthy. He vetoed its recharter in 1832 and moved federal funds to state banks, known as pet banks. On the other side, you had the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, who supported a stronger federal government. Remember that American system we talked about before? Well, the Whigs loved it. The thing is, the American system embodied every single thing Andrew Jackson despised. The debates in the American system weren't just political, they shaped the economy, infrastructure, and the direction of the country. As expansion roared heavily on the frontier, Jackson backed the frontier settlers with policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced Native American tribes off of their land. This led to the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee were forcibly relocated to what is now Oklahoma, suffering greatly along the way. Jackson's policies made him a hero to many frontier settlers, but his use of federal power sparked fierce debates about whether the government was protecting citizens or abusing its power, especially when it came to native lands and the economy. Topic 4.9 talks about the development of a new American culture. Between 1800 and 1848, America wasn't just growing politically or economically, it was developing its own national identity. This new national culture combined American, European, and regional influences. In art, you had movements like the Hudson River School, which painted breathtaking landscapes of the American frontier. It wasn't just for art's sake, it symbolized manifest destiny and the idea that American natural beauty was something special. Meanwhile, writers like Washington Irving gave us stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, blending European storytelling traditions with American settings and themes. But it wasn't all spooky stories and pretty paintings. Philosophy was evolving too. Case in point, Transcendentalism, a movement led by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They believed in individualism, nature, and the idea that humans could achieve personal perfection. Sounds inspiring, right? But it also had a political edge. Transcendentalists were big on social reform, especially abolitionism and women's rights. On the darker side of American culture, Gothic literature was making its mark. The big person here is Edgar Allan Poe with stories like The Telltale Heart, which is literally a story describing in vivid detail killing an old man, dismembering the body in a bathtub, and stuffing the body parts under a floorboard. I mean, hats off to this man. Finally, architecture played a key role in shaping the national identity. Buildings in Washington, D.C. like the White House and the Capitol were designed with neoclassical architecture inspired by ancient Greece and Rome. This is because America wanted to position itself as a modern republic with deep roots in democratic ideals. So the Second Great Awakening, what is it? Short answer, it was a religious revival. But more than that, it was a massive cultural shift that reshaped American society and politics. So you might be wondering, what caused the Second Great Awakening? Well, a few things. First was the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs. Second was a response to rationalism because of criticism of the Enlightenment being too rational-based. And let's not forget the market revolution, which uprooted communities and made people more mobile, creating new opportunities for religious movements to spread. Here's some examples of parts of this movement. Camp meetings became huge social events, especially on the frontier. Preachers like Charles G. Finley led emotional fury revivals in places like the burned-over district of New York, where religious enthusiasm ran so high it was said that there was no one left to convert. The Second Great Awakening also sparked major reform movements. Religious leaders preached that individuals could achieve personal salvation and improve society. This inspired people to tackle issues like abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. Jarena Lee and Harry Hosier? We'll go with Hosier. Two prominent African-American preachers challenged traditional ideas by showing that Black Americans and women could lead in spiritual life. And one more thing, new religious movements emerged. Joseph Smith founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, while William Miller's predictions about the end of the world led to the formation of the Adventist churches. So between 1800 and 1848, America experienced a wave of reform movements that aimed to fix society's problems and expand rights and opportunities. First, let's talk about what sparked these movements. The Second Great Awakening played a huge role. It wasn't just a religious revival, it encouraged people to believe that individuals could improve themselves and society. This, combined with the market revolution and greater mobility, made people more interested in reforming moral and social issues. So let's look at some reform movements. First up, abolition. The abolitionist movement grew in the North, calling for the immediate end of slavery. Leaders like William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, demanding freedom for enslaved people. Meanwhile, free African Americans like Frederick Douglass became powerful voices in the movement, sharing first first-hand accounts of slavery's horrors. Then there was women's rights. In 1848, reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention, where they called for the greater equality of women. They even issued the Declaration of Sentiments, which borrowed language from the Declaration of Independence to demand women's rights to vote. This caused this time period to be dubbed the era of first-wave feminism. The temperance movement aimed to reduce alcohol consumption. Reformers believed drinking led to poverty, crime, and broken families. And of course, you know that there's no way that's true. Organizers like the Daughters of Temperance pushed for laws to limit or ban alcohol. Finally, utopian communities popped up around the country. Groups like the Shakers and Brook Farm tried to create perfect societies by rejecting traditional norms and focusing on communal living. But if there's one thing this course should teach you, it is that life is suffering, and of course all of these communities failed. In this time period, African Americans, both enslaved and free, faced enormous challenges. But they also created communities and strategies to protect their dignity and fight for freedom. So what stayed the same and what changed? In the South, enslaved people continued to resist their oppression, but their efforts to end slavery were largely limited to rebellions, and most were unsuccessful. One of the most famous was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a violent uprising in Virginia that resulted in the deaths of over 50 people. The rebellion terrified Southern whites and led to harsher slave laws. Meanwhile, in the North, abolitionist movements were growing. The free African American population increased, especially in cities like Philadelphia and Boston. Many African Americans founded their own communities and institutions to preserve their culture and fight for their rights. For example, the African Meeting House in Boston, built in 1806, became a hub for education, abolitionist meetings, and religious services. One key thing African Americans did was use the press. In 1827, Freedom's Journal became the first Black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States. It gave African Americans a platform to speak out against slavery and challenge racist policies. But you have to understand, the biggest thing that helped these African Americans was their own spiritual commitment. Like, for example, enslaved people in New Orleans gathered at Congo Square on Sundays to play music, dance, and preserve their cultural traditions. These gatherings helped them maintain a sense of identity and community, even in the face of oppression. So here's the line to take away from this whole video. While African Americans faced harsh conditions of discrimination, they found ways to resist and fight for their freedom. America, a beautiful country of glorious cities, but there's really only one place you can call perfect. That's right, the American South. So what was the South like in this time period? Well, first off, geography and the environment shaped the South's economy and identity. Southern land was perfect for growing cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar, but there was also a problem: overcultivation. The soil in the Southeast became depleted, so slaveholders moved west, expanding plantations into new fertile land in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. Alright, enough beating around the bush. So slavery. Although most Southerners didn't own enslaved people, the region's economy and leadership were built on slavery. Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun went from calling slavery a necessary evil to defending it as a positive good. According to Calhoun, slavery wasn't just acceptable, it was essential to the Southern way of life. This focus on agriculture and slavery gave the South a distinct regional identity. While the North industrialized and diversified, the South stayed locked in traditional agriculture staples and resisted change. Southern business leaders kept relying on cotton exports to drive their economy, which made the South heavily dependent on both slavery and foreign trade. So what to take away from this is the South became its kind of own place and culture during this time period, and this tension with the North would, wait, say it with me, cause a future war. Alright, it is the 1840s, and Americans are looking west. This idea that Americans deserve and are destined to expand across the entire continent, that is something known and called manifest destiny, and it was very popular in this time period. So the big question is why? Why did Americans think they were destined to expand? Well, simply because land equaled opportunity. The West had resources, open land, and the chance to get rich. Farmers saw fertile soil, miners chased gold, and religious groups like the Mormons just wanted to be left alone in Utah. And if you want a city to blame on that, you can look at Salt Lake City. So people just started packing up and heading west. And when I say heading west, I mean thousands of settlers risking their lives on trails like the Oregon Trail. Imagine walking 2,000 miles, losing half of your wagon, fighting off dysentery, and all you get in the end is a nice view. But hey, for many, it was actually worth it. And that leads to the one image that will always forever be used to define manifest destiny. I mean, look at that angel. It's as if these people were meant to expand west. Or at least that's what they thought at the time. And the funny part is, the government wanted in on the expansion too. To help settlers, they passed the Homestead Act, basically handing out free land, that is, if you could survive on it, and the Pacific Railroad Act, which helped build railroads across the country. This made it way easier to move west, but the US wasn't just looking west, they were looking transnational. Americans wanted more trade with Asia, and in classic US fashion, they weren't exactly subtle about it. The Treaty of, I'm not even gonna try and pronounce that, opened up trade with China, and the Treaty of Kanagawa forced Japan to open its ports to American ships. I know I've said a million times that expansion westward would cause the Civil War, but before the Civil War, it will actually cause a revolution and another war. But that is a next video problem. So it's 1845 and James K. Polk is elected president. If there's one thing you should know about this guy, it is that he cared only about one thing: westward expansion. He started by negotiating with Britain to secure Oregon up to the 49th parallel. This would avoid war while expanding the US northwest. But here's the thing: as America expanded, tensions with Mexico escalated over the Texas border. The US claimed the Rio Grande, while Mexico insisted it was the New Cass River. Polk sent troops into the disputed Texas-Mexico border, and after a skirmish, he claimed, quote, American blood was shed on American soil. He used this as a justification to declare war in what was known as the Mexican-American War. After the US captures some major cities and blockades Mexico, which cripples its economy, they end up winning the war. This war would end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And while this treaty did a lot of things, what you should know is that it gave the US a lot of land. Like, a lot of land. This land was known as the Mexican Cession, and the issue of whether each state would be slave or free would need to be solved further at something known as the Compromise of 1850. It should also be noted that US interaction and conflict with American Indians and Mexican Americans would increase because of the westward expansion. These often resulted in many unfair treaties, or in the case of Sand Creek, it would lead to a bloody massacre, where hundreds were said to have been slaughtered in 1864. So, the Mexican-American War just ended, and the US gained a massive chunk of land. This land was known as the Mexican Cession. But here's the issue: should slavery be allowed in this new land or not? The North proclaimed no. The South, however, said yes. So yeah, we have another political crisis. There was an attempt to settle this issue early with something called the Wilmot Proviso. This was a proposal to ban slavery in all land gained from Mexico. It passed in the House, where the North had more representation, but failed in the Senate, where the South had enough power to block it. This failure only made sectional tensions worse, pushing the country closer to conflict. So what would attempt to solve this issue would be the Compromise of 1850. But it was, in many ways, a messy last-ditch attempt to keep the country from falling apart. The guy behind it, you guessed it, Henry Clay. This compromise had 5 parts, and they all tried to balance free and slave state interests. First was California would become a free state. Second is that Utah and New Mexico territories got to decide on slavery themselves through voting. Third is that the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. Fourth was a stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed, forcing Northerners to return escaped slaves. And 5, Texas got paid $10 million to give up some land claims. Yeah, I don't really understand that one either. The big part to know about this is the Fugitive Slave Act made Northerners furious. Even if they weren't abolitionists, they hated being forced to return enslaved people. This led to massive resistance, like the Underground Railroad working overtime, and northern states passing personal liberty laws to ignore the act altogether. Meanwhile, in the South, even though they got some wins from the compromise, they still weren't happy. They wanted an even bigger guarantee that slavery would expand. The failure of this compromise was easy to see, and this weak compromise is easily the biggest cause of the Civil War we have talked about thus far. We already know from the entirety of Unit 4 that the North and South at this time were essentially 2 different countries, with the North being industry-based and the South being farming-reliant. So now, stuff is going to happen in Europe. A series of revolutions break out in Europe around 1848, and a potato famine breaks out in Ireland, which causes tons of immigrants from Ireland and Germany to flood into the US, mostly all settling in northern cities. They built ethnic communities to preserve their language and culture, but not everybody welcomed them. But what you should understand is truly how many immigrants that came into the US. I mean, look at this graph and it spiked there. Need I even say more? Alright, enough about migration, let's look at some abolitionists. Even though abolitionists were a minority in the North, they made a lot of noise. As we've talked about before, Frederick Douglass gave fiery speeches, including What to the Slave is the 4th of July, exposing the hypocrisy of American freedom. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, exposing the horrors of slavery, a book that was said to be so influential that Lincoln supposedly said it started the Civil War. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad helped enslaved people escape to the North. The North and South weren't just disagreeing. They were on completely different planets at this point. Immigration, economic divide, and the fight over slavery kept deepening sectional conflict, making war almost inevitable. So it's truly time to examine the causes of the Civil War. At this point, every compromise about slavery has flopped. The Missouri Compromise gone. The Compromise of 1850 made things worse. So now let's look at the final attempts to hold this broken country together and how they spectacularly failed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act got passed, which allowed those states to freely vote on whether they wanted to allow slavery or not. And the funny part, that whole Missouri Compromise line from earlier, it didn't matter anymore because Nebraska was well above that line. But what you should know about this act is it caused thousands to pour into these states to vote for their own side, which led to what is called Bleeding Kansas, where everyone fought in the streets and killed each other over votes in Kansas. One of the people famous here was an absolutely insane man named John Brown, who was against slavery and staged a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry before being killed by the expertise of Robert E. Lee. The chaos of Bleeding Kansas and the spread of slavery enraged anti-slavery Northerners, leading to the formation of the Republican Party in 1854. But now that we have all this, let's contextualize and envision the world right now. We know from the Constitution that the US needs 3 branches of government to function, so let's look at each of them right now. First, the executive. Leading up to the Civil War, we see a collection of weak presidents that did nothing truly notable to address the issue of slavery. Okay, so the executive branch is a no-go, but let's try the legislative. Well, here in the Senate, Charles Sumner gave a speech against slavery, which caused a Southern congressman named Preston Brooks to beat him within an inch of his life with a cane. Okay, so the legislative is a bust, but as long as we have the Supreme Court, Dred Scott v. Sanford. God damn it. This case established that slaves were not citizens and Congress could not ban slavery in Southern territories. So we have the executive branch being weak. We have people caning each other on the Senate floor and the legislative, and deplorable, sadistic rulings by the Supreme Court. When you look at it this way, it honestly is hard to think a war couldn't have broken out. And I'll end this video with a quote from the most sane, reasonable, level-headed guy I can think of, John Brown. Right before he died, he said, quote, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." And guess what? He was right, because the Civil War started less than 2 years later. The stage is set. America is on the brink of collapse. The North and the South are done with compromises. Sectional tensions are at an all-time high, and now there's a presidential election that's about to decide the fate of the entire nation. America was so divided at this point that 4 different candidates ran for president. First, we have Abraham Lincoln for the Republican Party. He was against slavery spreading westward, but not planning to abolish it in the South. Next, you have Stephen Douglas, who was a Northern Democrat. His idea was to leave decisions in the hand of the people to vote for. Then we had John C. Breckinridge, who was a Southern Democrat. He was very pro-slavery, wanting it everywhere. And finally, we have John Bell with the Constitutional Union Party, who pleaded for the Constitution. Who cares? But the real issue, Lincoln's Republican Party was based entirely in the North, and he wasn't even on the ballot in 10 Southern states. But guess what? It didn't even matter. He won anyway. The moment Lincoln won, the South absolutely lost its mind. They saw it as the beginning of the end for slavery. South Carolina didn't wait around. It seceded just weeks after the election. By early 1861, 6 more states followed, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln ran on a campaign that had at its forefront to keep the Union together. He promised not to invade the South unless it was necessary to fulfill that. In April, the Confederates decided to enact the final straw and fired at Fort Sumter, a U.S. military base in South Carolina. Lincoln called for troops to put down the rebellion, and just like that, Civil War had begun. So, Lincoln is elected, the South secedes, and war is officially started. But here's the issue. The Union and Confederacy were nowhere near evenly matched. The North had more people, more industry, more railroads, and the ability to outproduce and outlast the South. The only thing the South really had was better generals and a home field advantage. But don't discount this part. The South had a population that was willing to fight to the death. And that's where the term, a war of attrition, truly comes from. The first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, where the Confederacy bombarded a U.S. fort in South Carolina. Lincoln responded by calling for troops, and just like that, the war had begun. But let's be clear, the Union was not prepared. The first major battle at Bull Run ended with a humiliating Union defeat, proving this war wouldn't be over quickly. So now we see 2 different war strategies unfold. The Confederacy's plan was simple: hold out, play defense, and hope Europe intervenes. Meanwhile, the Union launched the Anaconda Plan, a strategy to blockade the South, control the Mississippi River, and squeeze the Confederacy into submission. The early war saw Confederate victories, mostly thanks to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson outmaneuvering Union forces. Battles like Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, what the heck are these cities, showed that the South had a real shot at winning. Meanwhile, both sides struggled on the home front. The New York City draft riot showed anti-war sentiment in the North. North, while the Richmond bread riots exposed the starvation and desperation of the South. But then comes the turning point, 1863. First, we have the Battle of Gettysburg, where Lee tried to go on the offensive but got absolutely pummeled in a 3-day bloodbath, forcing him to retreat. And around the same time, Ulysses S. Grant won the Battle of Vicksburg, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in half. So now the war completely shifts. Grant is promoted and he brings in William Sherman, who introduces something known as total war. This guy truly was unbelievable. Sherman burned everything in his path through Georgia, destroying crops, railroads, and entire cities in his quote, march to the sea. Meanwhile, Grant takes on Lee directly, hammering the Confederates with non-stop battles, knowing that the North could replace soldiers, but the South really couldn't. By 1865, the South was done. Lee surrendered at the courthouse, and just like that, the Civil War was over. In the end, 698,000 people died. This makes the Civil War the deadliest war in American history. And no, we are not counting World War I or II in that. We talked about all the military stuff of the Civil War. Now let's examine the political side. At first, Lincoln made it clear, this war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. But as the war dragged on, that changed. Let's talk about how. By 1862, Lincoln knew the war needed a new purpose. And after the Union's sort of victory at Antietam, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document freed enslaved people in Confederate-held territories, but not in border states. It reframed the war as a fight against slavery, not just Union preservation. And third, it kept Europe, especially Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy. Now, even though it didn't immediately free all enslaved people, it was a game changer, because now thousands of formerly enslaved people escaped plantations and enlisted in the Union Army. By the end of this war, nearly 200,000 African Americans fought for the Union. The 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry Regiment and the 54th Massachusetts proved black soldiers were essential to the Union victory. After the bloodbath at Gettysburg, Lincoln gave a 2-minute speech that completely redefined the Civil War. In it, he said, number 1, the war was about preserving democracy and fulfilling the ideals of the Founding Fathers. And number 2, the Union must win, so government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. This speech solidified that America wasn't just fighting the South, it was fighting for its identity. But I want you to think beyond the political aspect for a second. For Black Americans all around the country, this wasn't about some simple politics. This was about having the simple human right to live freely. This is about being able to be treated with just some dignity in their life. This war was about freedom, democracy, and most of all, national unity. So the Civil War is over. So many battles of attrition along with various scorched earth policies have caused the South to be in ruins, literally. Yes, the South had lost the war, but now they were a part of the Union again, so the government tried to usher in an era known as Reconstruction to rebuild the South. Originally during the war, Lincoln issued his 10% plan that told the South he would readmit a southern state to the Union and give it America's protection and benefit so long as 10% of the voters pledged loyalty to him. Lincoln's plan aimed to be lenient and avoid punishing the South, focusing on restoring the Union quickly. But then Lincoln had to go and die in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth, which upset quite a bit. Andrew Johnson came in and gave his plan, which was very similar to Lincoln apart from offering pardons to former Confederates. Then later in Reconstruction, the radical Republican plan was put into effect as Republicans gained more power. This was meant to punish the South, protect black rights, and send the military to enforce it. The South absolutely hated this. And the thing is, Andrew Johnson hated radical Republicans and tried to veto everything. Congress responded by impeaching him, making him the first US president to almost be removed from office. Reconstruction also allowed some amendments to be passed as well. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th, which granted birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th, which gave black men the right to vote. But even though this seems like a good idea, you need to understand that this era was really no better for African Americans than before the Civil War. Almost immediately after the southern states were readmitted to the Union, they passed black codes, which were codes in the South that limited freedoms of African Americans and continuously forced African Americans into forced labor, despite slavery being technically over. Blacks worked the fields in a system known as sharecropping, where it wasn't technically slave labor, but with their wages, it might as well have been. There would be public events held in the South, where people would gather to watch African Americans be hanged, or tarred and feathered, or any number of ways to die, known as lynchings. And then you have organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League, which used literal terrorism to suppress black voters. All of this would force the North to just give up entirely and cause Reconstruction to fail, but that is a next video problem. So Reconstruction was supposed to fix the South and bring equality for all African Americans, but instead, it completely failed. At first, things looked promising. Black men gained citizenship and voting rights. Over 2,000 African Americans held public office, and federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce Reconstruction policies. But white Southerners hated this, and they fought back hard. We already talked about some examples of this being sharecropping, lynchings, and organizations like the KKK, but you also had things like convict leasing, where black men were arrested for made-up crimes and forced into unpaid labor. Then came the Supreme Court, which basically gave up on protecting black rights. The slaughterhouse cases in 1873 gutted the 14th Amendment by saying civil rights were a state issue, not a federal one. In the US v. that, they said that the federal government couldn't punish white mobs that murdered black Americans. With no one left to enforce black rights, white Southerners took control again. And then came the final nail in the coffin, being the Compromise of 1877. Essentially, the 1876 presidential election was a mess, so Republicans and Democrats made a backroom deal. The North would remove troops from the South, and in return they would elect a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, as president. But this would mean Reconstruction would end, and the South could do whatever it wanted. So, that's exactly what happened. Black rights were crushed for nearly a century. Jim Crow laws, segregation, and voter suppression took over. Reconstruction was the US's first attempt at civil rights, and it failed miserably. But the 14th and 15th Amendments didn't go away. They became the legal foundation for the civil rights movement 100 years later. Just like that, Unit 5 is done. Reconstruction has ended, and nothing bad happens in American history ever again. Right? Anyway, why don't you subscribe to this YouTube channel? It's my non-educational channel, and I promise it's 1,000% cooler than this one. Come on. Please? Please?